Welcome! Today, we're diving into a really fundamental question. How do we actually know what happened in the past? I mean, we can't go back and watch it, right? So we're going to unpack the logical toolkit that historians use to take all these scattered clues from the past and build them into a story that makes sense. And really, this is the central challenge, isn't it? The past is gone. All we have left are these little echoes, these traces left behind. So the big question for us is, how do we take those fragments and piece them together into a picture we can actually trust? Let's get into it. So here's our game plan. We're going to start really big with the whole idea of knowledge itself. Then we'll zoom in on the specific kind of logic that historians use to think. And from there, we'll see how that logic actually shapes the whole research process, right down to the nitty-gritty of how you handle historical sources. All right, let's kick things off with our first section, the quest for knowledge. Have you ever stopped to think that pretty much all of human progress comes from our ability to understand the world around us? But how we gain that understanding has changed a lot. You know, for early societies, a lot of learning was just trial and error. You see what works, you see what doesn't, and you pass it on. But today, progress relies on something way more systematic, structured research. And this isn't just for scientists and lab coats. For historians, understanding the method of research is every bit as crucial as knowing the facts. It's what separates professional history from just telling a good story. Okay, now we're getting to the absolute heart of the matter, a little thing called inference. This is the mental engine that drives all knowledge. It's how we get from what we already know to what we don't know yet. And for a historian, it is, without a doubt, the most important tool in the entire toolkit. So, what is inference, really? Well, simply put, it's that mental leap you take from a set of known facts to a brand new conclusion. The philosopher Thomas Aquinas had a great way of putting it. Reasoning is just moving from what you understand to what you don't understand yet. For a historian, that's the whole job, right? It's how you look at a dusty old letter and a worn-out coin and figure out something new about a world that's long gone. Now, inference kind of comes in two main flavors. The best way to think about it is to put on your detective hat. First, you've got deductive reasoning. This is your classic top-down logic. You start with a general rule you know is true, and you apply it to a specific case. On the other hand, you have inductive reasoning. This is bottom-up logic. You don't have a rule to start with. Instead, you look at a bunch of specific clues and try to find a pattern to create a new theory. Let's look at a classic deductive example. It's super straightforward. Premise 1, a general rule. All humans are mortal. We know that's true. Premise 2, a specific fact. Raja is a human. So, what's the conclusion? Therefore, Raja is mortal. See, the conclusion isn't a guess. It's a rock-solid certainty as long as the first two statements are true. Deduction is all about that kind of certainty. Okay, now let's flip it and look at induction. Imagine you observe a swan, and hey, it's white. Then you see another, and they're all white. You might start to think, you know what? I bet all swans are white. And that's a fantastic new idea. It's a great theory, but it's not guaranteed. Because as Europeans eventually found out when they got to Australia, oops, there are black swans. Induction is amazing for generating new ideas, but you always have to be ready to test them. And, you know, it's really important to realize that these ideas aren't just from Western philosophy. In Indian thought, there's this incredibly powerful concept called anumana. It's all built on the idea of an unbreakable link, what's called vyapti, between a sign and the thing it's signifying. The classic example is the relationship between smoke and fire. If you see one, you can infer the other. What's so cool is how the Nyaya school of philosophy laid this out in a brilliant 5-step argument. Check this out. You start with a proposition. The hill has fire. The reason? Because it has smoke. Then comes the key part, the example that makes it universal. Wherever there is smoke, there is fire, like in a kitchen. That's your inductive observation. Then you apply that rule back to the specific case, and you reach your final deductive conclusion. Therefore, the hill has fire. It's this beautiful, complete system of logic. Okay, so we have our logical toolkit. We understand inference. Now what? How does all this abstract logic actually play out in the day-to-day work of a historian? Let's take a look. A lot of people think history is just about memorizing names and dates, but it's so much more than that. It's really an analytical process. A historian is like a detective for time, trying to figure out not just what happened, but why it mattered and how those events from long ago still shape our world right now. The real goal isn't just to list a bunch of facts, it's to build an explanation. And this is a really big but, we have to acknowledge a huge limitation here. Historians are working with evidence that's almost always incomplete. Plus, every historian brings their own perspective and asks their own questions. So what does that mean? It means there's no single, final, absolute truth with a capital T in history. Instead, you should think of history as a living, breathing conversation, one that's constantly being revised as new evidence and new viewpoints come along. So, if history is so complex and always changing, how do we keep it from just becoming a free-for-all where anyone's opinion is valid? Well, how do historians make sure their work is actually rigorous? They follow a plan, a systematic blueprint called a research design that guides them from start to finish. Pretty much any piece of serious historical writing you'll ever read follows a path that looks a lot like this. It always starts with a spark, a question, a problem, something that needs figuring out. That spark leads you on a hunt for evidence. But just finding clues isn't enough. You have to evaluate them, question them, test their reliability. Only then can you start to weave them together into a coherent story. This whole process is what gives history its integrity. Now, right at the heart of that process is the evidence itself, the raw material that history is built from. And for historians, this material really falls into two fundamental categories. So what's the big difference between them? Well, it all boils down to one simple word: proximity. A primary source is a first-hand account. It was created at the time of the event by someone who was a direct witness. This is your raw evidence. A secondary source, on the other hand, is an analysis or interpretation that's created later by someone who wasn't there but who is studying the primary sources. So what does this look like in the real world? Well, primary sources are things like archival records, think letters and government memos, their personal diaries and journals, speeches, photographs, even physical artifacts like old coins, seals, or the ruins of a building. These are the direct, unfiltered traces of the past, the building blocks for any argument a historian makes. And then you have your secondary sources. This is stuff you're probably pretty familiar with: textbooks, scholarly articles, biographies, encyclopedias, and monographs, which is just a fancy term for a really deep dive book on one very specific topic. These are all incredibly important because they analyze, interpret, and synthesize all that raw data from the primary sources, helping us see the bigger picture. So let's bring all these different threads together. We've gone on a pretty big journey, from the abstract world of logical principles all the way down to the concrete, practical steps a historian takes to build an account of the past. So if you only remember a few key things, let it be these. First, historical knowledge isn't just a collection of facts. It's built on a foundation of logical inference. Second, historians use both deduction for certainty and induction for new discoveries. Third, good historical research isn't random. It's a systematic process. And finally, and this is so important, everything depends on critically evaluating your sources, because history is always an interpretation, not a final truth. So why does all this matter? Because understanding these core ideas, inference, research design, source evaluation, this is the foundation for everything else in historical methodology. You absolutely need to get this down before you can tackle more advanced topics, like digging through archives or developing your own unique research project. So, I want to leave you with one final question to think about. If every historical account we read is an interpretation, not a perfect photograph of the past, then how do we decide which version of the past to trust? How do we judge which account is more reliable, more compelling, or more valuable than another? Answering that question, well, that's the real craft of being a historian.